Most people assume that intelligence reveals itself through words, through explanations, through visible reasoning shared openly with others. Yet when you observe individuals who hold significant wealth, you notice an unusual restraint, a pattern of silence where conversation is expected. They do not rush to clarify their intentions. They do not narrate their decisions. They allow gaps in understanding to remain untouched. This silence is often misread as arrogance, secrecy, or emotional distance, but it is rooted in something far more psychological. The average person speaks to manage perception, to reduce misunderstanding, to keep social harmony intact. Wealthy individuals slowly learn that managing perception is an exhausting responsibility that produces very little return. So they stop performing clarity for others and begin preserving clarity for themselves. They do not feel compelled to correct every wrong assumption formed about them. They do not feel urgency to respond to curiosity that has no consequence. They allow people to wonder, to speculate, to remain partially informed without discomfort. This creates a strange tension in social spaces, because most people rely on explanation as a form of emotional reassurance. When that reassurance is absent, observers feel unsettled without knowing why. The silence forces others to confront their own need to understand what was never theirs to know. And this is where the psychological difference begins to reveal itself. Wealthy individuals are comfortable existing without being fully understood by everyone around them. They do not experience misunderstanding as a threat to their identity. They experience it as a normal condition of independent thinking. The need to be understood fades when internal certainty becomes strong enough. So they speak less, not because they lack thoughts, but because their thoughts are not designed for public display. They move through conversations without offering access to the internal processes behind their actions. And this quiet behavior carries a weight that words often fail to achieve. People sense depth without receiving explanation, authority without receiving narrative. This is the beginning of a silence that is not empty, but psychologically deliberate. At the center of this silence lies a fundamental shift in how value is assigned to social interaction and mental energy. Most people equate conversation with connection, and explanation with respect, forming habits of constant verbal engagement. From childhood, they are trained to justify actions to authority figures, creating a reflex to explain whenever questioned. This reflex becomes deeply tied to feelings of safety, acceptance, and belonging within groups. Wealthy individuals gradually detach from this conditioning as their environment changes what safety means. Safety no longer depends on social approval. It depends on the quality of decisions and the protection of focus. This creates a psychological reorientation where internal clarity becomes more important than external understanding. They begin to see explanation as an unnecessary expenditure of cognitive resources. Behavioral psychology shows that humans speak more when they seek validation or fear social rejection. Once those fears lose relevance, the urge to explain diminishes naturally. Silence becomes comfortable because it no longer feels socially dangerous. Another factor is control of attention. Wealthy individuals treat attention as a limited asset rather than an unlimited resource. Explaining to everyone who asks becomes an inefficient use of that asset. They reserve detailed communication for situations where it affects real outcomes, such as partnerships or strategic decisions. Everyone else receives minimal information because additional detail produces no measurable benefit. They also understand that explanations often invite opinions, advice, and emotional influence from people outside the decision. By reducing explanation, they reduce external influence on their thinking. This preserves the integrity of their decision-making process. There is also a narrative component. Once you explain your reasoning, others feel invited to reinterpret and discuss it. This creates conversations that drift away from action into interpretation and debate. Wealthy individuals prefer conversations that revolve around execution rather than interpretation. They learn that the fewer words they use about their reasoning, the fewer distractions follow. Emotionally, they develop tolerance for being misunderstood, because they have experienced how little misunderstanding affects results. Over time, this tolerance becomes a default posture rather than a conscious strategy. They are not trying to appear mysterious. They are simply no longer trying to appear understandable. In meetings, they often deliver conclusions without narrating the long path that produced them. Colleagues feel the weight of certainty without access to the reasoning behind it. At dinners, they answer personal questions with brief replies, then gently redirect the focus, leaving others aware of a boundary they cannot easily cross. When plans change suddenly, they announce the new direction calmly, without revisiting the doubts and calculations that preceded the decision. Friends notice they rarely debate opinions for long. They state a position once and allow disagreement to exist without further explanation. During negotiations, they reveal intentions slowly, watching reactions carefully while offering very little about their internal priorities. If criticized publicly, they resist the urge to defend themselves, choosing instead to let time and results reshape perception quietly. On social platforms, they share milestones without emotional backstories. Achievements appear without narratives designed to invite admiration or sympathy. When asked how success happened, they provide simplified answers, accurate yet incomplete, protecting the complexity of their private thinking process. In family discussions, they avoid emotional arguments about choices, repeating decisions calmly without expanding into persuasive explanations. Employees sometimes feel puzzled by the clarity of instruction paired with the absence of detailed reasoning behind those instructions. They decline invitations without constructing elaborate excuses, a simple refusal that feels unusually firm and strangely respectful. If someone misunderstands their actions, they rarely correct the misunderstanding, unless it interferes directly with important outcomes. They do not participate in gossip because gossip depends on explaining other people's motives without responsibility for consequences. When purchasing unusual items, they do not justify the expense, behaving as though justification is irrelevant to observers. People often describe them as reserved or difficult to read, sensing depth but receiving very little verbal confirmation. Over time, others stop demanding explanations, learning that pressing for clarity rarely produces additional information. This changes social dynamics quietly. Conversations become shorter and less emotionally demanding around them. Their presence creates an atmosphere where results matter more than stories, and actions speak without commentary. Small daily interactions slowly teach others to relate based on respect rather than curiosity about personal reasoning. This pattern repeats across environments, shaping how they are perceived without them deliberately trying to control perception. They conserve energy by refusing to enter conversations that begin with why and end without productive outcomes. The silence becomes familiar to those around them, eventually interpreted as stability rather than secrecy. And through hundreds of such moments, their social world adjusts to a person who does not trade clarity for approval. This behavior rests on an unusual tolerance for social discomfort, a capacity to let tension remain without rushing to resolve it verbally. Most people explain themselves to reduce awkwardness in conversations, using words to restore emotional balance in shared spaces. Wealthy individuals allow that imbalance to exist because they do not experience it as a threat to their identity. They possess strong internal validation, which removes the urgency to repair how others perceive their choices. Cognitively, this creates an environment where decisions are evaluated privately rather than negotiated socially through explanation. They understand that every explanation invites interpretation, and interpretation often leads to distraction from meaningful action. Their minds operate with a hierarchy of attention, where only issues affecting outcomes deserve sustained focus. Curiosity about their reasoning ranks very low within this hierarchy, making explanation feel unnecessary and draining. There is also an emotional detachment from judgment, built from repeated experiences of being misunderstood without consequence. Instead of correcting every false impression, they plan their lives knowing misinterpretation is inevitable and manageable. Silence also creates a subtle power dynamic. Uncertainty about them causes others to approach interactions more carefully. They recognize that predictability often invites manipulation, while limited information preserves psychological advantage. Over time, conversations around them become more functional and less interpretive, reducing emotional noise in daily life. They begin preferring communication that serves execution rather than satisfying curiosity about internal thinking processes. This preference reinforces the habit of speaking less about motives and more about actions and expectations. A quiet emotional maturity develops here, where being understood by everyone is no longer considered necessary. They accept being perceived as distant if that distance protects clarity and preserves mental energy. What many interpret as arrogance is often simply psychological independence from social validation. They do not withhold explanation to control others, but to prevent others from controlling their attention. This is the deeper mechanism behind their silence, a form of self-protection that looks like mystery from the outside. Sometimes reflections like these feel rare in a noisy environment, and if this calm examination of behavior feels valuable, you may choose to subscribe quietly for future observations. Not from pressure or excitement, but from a preference for returning to thoughtful analysis that respects attention and explores human patterns without unnecessary noise. Many assume wealthy silence is theatrical, as if quietness is performed to appear mysterious, when it is usually a practical response to repeated social inefficiencies. Another misconception suggests they are hiding unethical motives, yet most silence simply protects focus rather than concealing wrongdoing from curious observers. People often believe constant explanation signals honesty, overlooking how explanations frequently become performances designed to manage impressions and emotional reactions. There is a belief that good communicators always articulate reasoning, ignoring how true confidence often removes the need for repeated articulation. Observers sometimes interpret their restraint as emotional coldness, when it is usually emotional discipline about where energy is invested. A common myth claims transparency automatically builds trust, while excessive openness can erode respect and invite unnecessary familiarity. Many think wealthy individuals dislike questions, when in reality they dislike questions that do not influence meaningful outcomes. Another assumption is that they enjoy confusing people, yet confusion is rarely intentional and simply a byproduct of limited explanation. People equate friendliness with detailed storytelling, misunderstanding that warmth can exist without constant narrative sharing. There is also a cultural expectation that kind people always justify their decisions, which quietly pressures individuals into over-explaining themselves. Wealthy individuals separate moral character from conversational accessibility, allowing them to be fair without being endlessly available. They understand that frequent explanation can create expectations they never agreed to manage for others. Some believe their silence signals insecurity, not realizing it often reflects deep comfort with internal certainty and independent thinking. Another myth suggests they are poor at communication, when they are often highly precise and selective about when communication is necessary. They recognize that words can create obligations, interpretations, and debates that consume time without producing progress. By limiting explanations, they limit the number of conversations that drift into emotional negotiation rather than practical resolution. People also mistake this restraint for pride, overlooking how it is often a learned response to repeated social fatigue. In reality, many have simply discovered that clarity is best demonstrated through consistent outcomes rather than persuasive speech. Their silence is not a rejection of people, but a rejection of unnecessary psychological exchanges. Over time, you begin to notice that the urge to explain often reveals an invisible dependence on how others interpret your actions and motives. And the absence of that urge signals a form of internal stability that most people rarely cultivate consciously. Wealthy individuals move through social environments without attempting to manage every assumption formed about them by observers. They accept that misunderstanding is natural, and that explanation cannot fully prevent it regardless of effort invested. So they reserve their words for moments where speech can change something tangible and meaningful in their environment. Everything else remains unsaid, not from indifference, but from a careful awareness of where attention truly belongs. This awareness removes many draining conversations from their lives, leaving more energy for decisions that actually matter. People around them slowly adjust, learning to interact without expecting constant psychological access to private reasoning. Curiosity about their motives gradually transforms into quiet respect for their consistency and calm direction. Because when someone does not feel compelled to explain themselves, it suggests their direction is anchored internally rather than socially. That internal anchor is rarely visible, yet it can be sensed in how they speak less and act with steady certainty. You begin to realize that the loudest environments are filled with explanations, while the quietest environments are filled with decisions. And somewhere between noise and silence lies a difference between those who need to be understood and those who no longer depend on it.